My name is Claire Lewis, and I'm with the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program. And I'd like to welcome you here today for the Florida Friendly Landscaping Professional Webinar Series. Today's webinar is Pollinator Gardens with Dr. Rachel Mallinger. She'll provide tips on how to attract bees to your landscape and how to select and design for bee-friendly landscapes. This webinar is approved for one FNGLA and CEU, one Florida Water Star CEU, and an LIAF CEU as well. For those CEUs, there's a $10 admission fee to receive this certificate. I'll put the link in the chat box if you would like that CEU to make payment. And then something else to keep in mind, this is part of a monthly webinar series held on the second Tuesday of the month at 10 o'clock. Our next webinar is an overview of the latest research related to soil amendments. It's with Drs. Evan Bean and AJ Reisinger. And just so you know, your microphones have been muted. I think everybody's familiar with the chat box. I see a lot of chat in there. So go ahead and type any questions you have into the chat box, and we'll be sure to take them at the end of the presentation. And one other thing is I would like to announce that the Florida Friendly Landscaping Awards program has been opened up. So we'd like to encourage you to submit a project or a landscape for an award if you've been working on something that you feel qualifies for a Florida Friendly landscape. It's held every other year, and the purpose of this is to recognize projects and people who are making a difference to Florida's environment. There's award categories for both professionals and homeowners. And if your home, community, or project qualifies, it's a great opportunity to highlight this achievement. Winners will be showcased on the FFL website and social media platforms. And winning an award can provide recognition for your achievements and motivation for your employees as well. So please consider submitting for an application. I'll put the link for that in the chat box as well. And at the end of this webinar today, you'll see a pop-up for a survey. And if you can, please take the time to fill that out. It really helps us determine what types of educational programming we'll be scheduling for next year and what your interests are. So I appreciate your time and effort on that. And with that, I'll turn this over to Tom Wickman to introduce today's speaker.
Claire, thank you so much. My name is Tom Wickman. I'm the statewide coordinator for the Green Industries Best Management Practices program here with University of Florida IFAS Extension, all part of Florida Friendly Landscaping. And it's my pleasure today to be able to present. Today's presenter is Dr. Rachel Mallinger. She's an assistant professor in the Entomology and Nematology Department here at the University of Florida. Dr. Mallinger is a pollinator ecologist focusing primarily on native wild bees. She's originally from Minnesota, and now she brings her research and expertise to Florida. She's interested in the basic biology of native wild bees, their response to anthropogenic disturbance, and their role in the pollination of both crop and wild plants. A major focus of her research program is to integrate approaches from landscape ecology and community ecology to better understand pollinator community dynamics and plant-pollinator interactions at multiple spatial scales. She conducts research in a variety of ecosystems, including natural, agricultural, and urban settings, with the overall arching goal of informing people about pollinator conservation and improving pollination services. Today, Dr. Mallinger is presenting Creating Pollinator Habitat. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Mallinger. Take it away.
All right, thanks, Tom, and thank you all for joining. Today, I'm going to be talking about first taking a sort of broader view of pollinators and pollination, introducing you to what pollination is, and that will help us understand what pollinators are. There may be some obvious ones that come to mind, honeybees or perhaps hummingbirds, perhaps bumblebees, and then there may be others that you are less familiar with, other unrecognized or lesser recognized pollinators. So we're going to take a broader view at first, talk about pollinators and pollination and pollinator needs in general. And then I'm going to narrow in on bees in particular. As Tom and Claire mentioned, this is my group of focus and of interest, but many of the things that you can do to help bee pollinators will help other pollinators as well, and I'll talk about that. And then I'll end with what you can do other than just planting flowers or planting plants for pollinators, other landscape and conservation tips. that apply to bees as well as other pollinators. So first of all, what is pollination? I think that we hear a lot about pollinators in the news, and we don't often connect that to pollination. So first, I just want to introduce you or remind you of pollination. Depending on your background, you may be more or less familiar with this. So pollination is part of the reproductive process for some, but not all plants. So plants can reproduce in a variety of ways, both sexually and asexually, through things like tubers and runners, through seeds, through spores. And pollination is part of sexual reproduction. So it's part of the way that plants reproduce sexually, but not all plants go through pollination as part of that sexual reproduction process. What is pollination? It specifically refers to the movement of pollen from the male reproductive parts where it is produced. And those are shown there, the anthers that produce that pollen. The pollen is moved from those to the female reproductive organ, the stigma. And this can happen within a single flower. If that flower has both anthers and a stigma, the pollen can move within the flower. It can move between flowers on the same plant, or it can move between flowers on different plants. And after successful pollination, so when viable pollen is delivered from that male part to the female part, that results in fertilization, which then results in fruit and seed set. Cross-pollination is when that pollen moves from flowers on one individual plant to another individual plant, while self-pollination occurs within the same plant, either within the same flower or flowers, different flowers on the same plant. So again, self-pollination would happen within that individual flower or flowers on the same plant, and cross-pollination happening between flowers on two different plants. And it's important to note that pollination itself can be done by different agents. So it can be done by wind, it can be done by water, it can be done by gravity or just agitation, and it can also be done by animals. The plants that produce pollen are the gymnosperms, our evergreens, conifers, cycads, as well as the flowering plants, the angiosperms. Other plants, things like mosses, algae, ferns, do not produce pollen. So they do not go through the pollination process, and they don't reproduce in that way. So the only plants that produce pollen are these gymnosperms and these angiosperms. And of those two groups, the angiosperms are the ones that are animal pollinated. So those are the ones that rely on animals. And this is important to note because these are also the ones that are visited by animals. Animals don't really visit these other plant taxa as frequently. Gymnosperms do produce pollen, and we do sometimes see pollinators visiting them for pollen, but they don't rely on animals to transfer that pollen. So the angiosperms, the flowering plants, those are the ones that rely on animals to transfer pollen, while the gymnosperms are primarily wind pollinated. These angiosperms, the ones that rely on animal pollinators and attract animal pollinators, typically have very showy flowers, like shown in the far right image. So they have showy flowers, they have a lot of cues, a lot of attractants, and they also produce rewards like nectar to lure pollinators to the flower. Other plants that are primarily wind pollinated or water pollinated, including the gymnosperms, they do not produce showy flowers. So they produce pollen, as in the case of, for example, gymnosperms, but they do not produce these showy flowers to lure pollinators in. And it's important to note that nectar is only a reward, so that really exists just to attract the pollinators. Pollen also functions as a reward. Many animals will actually collect and consume that pollen, but the pollen is also what allows the plant to reproduce. It has the male sex cells, and so it's integral to plant reproduction, but also functions as a reward, while nectar is just purely a reward for those animal pollinators. Which animals are pollinators? Really anything that visits a flower and has the capacity to transfer pollen. This includes bees and butterflies, some of those more readily recognized pollinators, but also includes wasps, beetles, birds, bats, and in some cases even rodents. Here in Florida, we don't have much pollination by bats or rodents. The pollination occurs primarily by insects, and those include, again, butterflies, moths, beetles, flies, wasps, and bees. We know that pollinators are very important, and I probably don't need to tell you all this, a bit of preaching to the choir, but pollinators are very important in different habitats and different ecosystems. An estimated 85% of those angiosperm plants are animal pollinated. So these again are, angiosperms are a very diverse group of plants that produce showy flowers, but 85% of them are animal pollinated. The ones that are not, that make up that 15%, would include the grasses, plants in the Poaceae family. Those are primarily wind pollinated, but the vast majority of angiosperms are animal pollinated. And so pollinators help to maintain plant diversity in these natural ecosystems, because without animal mediated pollination, these plants would not be able to reproduce. They also have effects on other animal taxa. For example, by producing seeds and fruit as a result of pollination, they help to produce food for other animals. Many other animals rely on those fruits and seeds as a food source. So they're not only helping plants reproduce, but they're providing food sources for birds and mammals in the form of fruits and seeds. We also know that a large majority of our crop plants are animal pollinated. An estimated 87 of 115 global crops rely on animal pollination. And when you look at a per acre or per hectare basis, it's about 35% of global crop production is animal pollinated to some degree. Again, those crops that are not animal pollinated are primarily grass crops. Think of things like corn and rice. Those are primarily wind pollinated and self-pollinated. But many of our most nutritious crops, including fruits and seeds, as well as the things that really make our diets fun and diverse, like coffee and cocoa, are animal pollinated. I showed this slide before and mentioned that many different animals pollinate. I'm going to focus primarily on insects and primarily on bees for the remainder of this, but I'll also touch on butterflies and hummingbirds, as those are two groups that many people try to create habitat for. So I will bring up butterflies and hummingbirds frequently, but I'm going to focus a lot on bees, and that's for two reasons. One, bees are arguably the most important pollinators. This is particularly true in more temperate climates. So from Florida north, bees are very important pollinators. In more tropical climates, you have greater contributions by other taxa, but in more temperate climates, bees are really arguably the very most important group of pollinators. They are specialized pollinators. They have body features that enable them to transfer that pollen. And this is because they are actually interested in the pollen itself. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But bees are actually collecting the pollen to eat and to feed their offspring. So they have features that really help them move that pollen around. Other insects and other animals are really just visiting for the nectar for the most part. And there are some exceptions, but for the most part, they just visit for the nectar. And so they sort of accidentally get pollen on their bodies and carry that around. So what do we know about plants for bees versus butterflies? Again, I mentioned that I'm really going to be narrowing in on bees, but I do want to compare and contrast that with gardening for butterflies as well as hummingbirds. When you garden for butterflies, you really need two different types of plants. You need host plants, which is the food source for the caterpillars or the larvae. And these host plants provide leaves. That's what the caterpillars or the larvae eat. And you really need native plants. So if you're putting out host plants for caterpillars, these should be native plants. The caterpillars have evolved with those native plants and rely on those native plants. When you put out these host plants, you will note that they look like they've been, if they're successful, they'll look like they've been attacked by pests because the caterpillars, the larvae, will be eating those leaves. I have milkweed in my yard that frequently doesn't have any leaves on it at all because the monarchs have chomped them all away. So that's what you put out for the caterpillars. For the adults, they will feed on nectar. Adult butterflies will feed on other things. Some feed on pollen, some feed on fruits, but many adult butterflies feed primarily on nectar. So what you're putting out for the adult butterflies are plants that produce showy flowers with abundant nectar. And in that adult stage, butterflies are less particular about native versus non-native, so they will visit non-native plants as a nectar source. And so for nectar, you can mix and match native and non-native plants. How does that compare with bees? Bees in that larval stage, that's analogous to the caterpillar. That stage, they're small grub-like larvae. They look a little bit like caterpillars, but they're less mobile. They just remain in their nest. They don't go out searching for food, but they rely on the food that the mother has brought back to the nest. And in that stage, they consume both pollen and nectar, but pollen is the primary food source in that stage. So they're feeding primarily on pollen as well as some amount of nectar in that grub-like larval analogous to the caterpillar stage. And in that stage, many of them rely on native plants, or at least do better on native plants. So they need flowers that produce pollen, and the best choice are native plants, although some bees will do okay on non-native plants as well. In the adult stage, the adult bees are feeding on pretty much the same thing, a mix of pollen and nectar, although in this case, they consume more nectar relative to pollen. So in both stages, they're consuming pollen and nectar, but in the adult stage, it shifts to a greater focus on nectar. Like butterflies, they're a little less particular about their food source in the adult stage, and so they can consume nectar from non-native plants to a greater degree than they can when they're in that larval stage. I mean, you can sort of think about this compared to humans or other organisms. When we're growing, when we're developed, when we're young, that's when we really need nutrients to fuel that growth. And that's true for these caterpillars or these larvae. When they're in that immature larval stage, they need particular food sources. They're a little less particular as adults. So it's important to recognize that for butterflies, the two different plants, the host plants and the adult plants, will be very different because the host plants are providing leaves and the adult plants are providing flowers with nectar. For bees, they're really the same plants. You plant plants for bees, or you put plants for bees in your garden. Those plants are going to serve as food sources for both that larval immature stage and the adult stage. So it's not two different groups of plants. Oh, sorry about that. I don't know if you guys can hear that. There's some recording on that slide. So I'm just going to recap bees, plants for bees versus butterflies. So bees need, again, plants that produce pollen and nectar. Butterflies need plants that produce leaves for that caterpillar stage. And then they also need plants that produce nectar. Some other differences include bees have longer tongues. And so they will, butterflies have longer tongues. And so they will feed from plants that have long and deep flower tubes, while bees have shorter tongues. And so they will feed from plants that do not have as long of a flower tube. And then finally, butterflies can see the color red. And so they will visit red, orange, and pink flowers, while bees do not see that color red. They perceive it as more of a gray. And so they are not as attracted to those flowers. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end here. So again, to recap, plants for bees versus butterflies, and I'm going to throw hummingbirds in here as well. Bee plants will be plants that have either flat flowers or flowers that have shallow or medium length flower tubes. These tubes tend to be wider. Again, bee tongues are not as long, and so they need to access nectar as well as pollen from flowers that have short to medium length flower tubes and are wider. Bees, again, do not see that color red. They perceive it as a sort of gray. And so they primarily visit yellow, white, and blue-purple flowers. They also need a landing pad. Bees cannot hover, and so they need to be able to land on the flower. They cannot visit flowers that are hanging upside down. So you can see that picture in the top left of a hummingbird, and that is able to visit a flower that is hanging down because it can hover. A bee would not be able to visit that flower very easily. Butterfly plants include variable shapes and variable colors, but they can include long, narrow flower tubes because butterfly tongues are longer. They can also include red, orange, pink, because again, butterflies can see that color red. And butterflies also need a landing pad, so they cannot hover. Finally, hummingbirds, I mentioned they can hover, so they do not need a landing pad. They can visit flowers that are sort of hanging upside down, like the one you see here. They often visit very large flowers. Large flowers tend to produce large amounts of nectar. Hummingbirds are larger bodied, so they require larger amounts of nectar. So when you're picking plants for hummingbirds, look for larger flowers. They will also visit red, orange, pink, just like butterflies, and may be preferentially found on those red, orange, pink flowers. And like butterflies, they can also visit deep or long flower tubes. So there's a lot of overlap between butterfly and hummingbird plants, including the fact that they can have long, narrow flower tubes and be red, orange, and pink. The difference being that hummingbird plants often have larger flowers and they don't need a landing pad. So the flowers can be hanging upside down. All right, so I'm gonna, again, kind of narrow in on bees for a little bit here. And I first want to point out that there are different kinds of bees. And so the plants that you would put out for bees will vary depending on whether you're trying to provide resources for honeybees or other kinds of bees. Honeybees are a single species in the United States, and this is a non-native species. They exist in both managed and feral colonies. From about Orlando south, there are abundant feral colonies. So many people will find that the honeybee is the main, or in some cases, the only visitor in their garden, especially if you live in South Florida. If you live in North Florida or north of Florida, I think we have some folks from Georgia and elsewhere, you may see fewer honeybees. There aren't as many feral colonies, and this may depend on whether you're located close to an apiary or not. But it's important to remember that this is just a single species and that it's not native. In comparison, we have over 300 species of native wild bees in Florida and about 5,000 in North America. And these bees have a variety of behaviors and a variety of preferences. They include bees like bumblebees, carpenter bees, two groups that many people are familiar with, as well as sweat bees and leafcutter bees. I've shown in these pictures here a common sweat bee on the top. This is Halictus poii. It's a very common bee. Looks a bit similar to a honeybee, but it has a very black body with white stripes, as opposed to that orange and gray coloration that a honeybee has. And below that is the leafcutter bee. These bees tend to be sort of round with a very pointed abdomen. So the tip of the bee there has quite a point, while the rest of the body is quite round. And they tend to also be black and white striped. So those are two examples of other bees that you may see in your landscape. And the reason I point out that there are different kinds of bees is that the plant preferences will vary across these different bee groups. And this is a graph from some data that a student of mine collected looking at bee visitation to a bunch of different so-called pollinator plants. And I'll point out, first of all, that there are a number of plants that really don't attract insect pollinators, or at least don't attract bees, including, for example, petunias and paperflower. But we do find that there are others that are quite attractive to bees. When you look at those yellow bars, those are plants that attract honeybees. So the plant that was most attractive to honeybees was basil, and this is African blue basil in particular. This is a non-native plant, and remember that honeybees are also not native. So it makes sense that they may visit a non-native cultivated plant. In comparison, when you look at the red bars, those are plants that attract bumblebees, we found that salvia, in this case, Wendy's Wish, was the cultivar or the type of salvia that we had. And that was the most attractive to bumblebees. And another type of salvia was the second most attractive. When we look at other bees, including the leafcutter bees and the sweat bees, we see that beech sunflower was the most attractive. And beech sunflower is native. And so it makes sense that a native plant would be the most attractive to these native bees, while a non-native plant was most attractive to our non-native honeybees. This is particularly important to point out because I'll often tell people that a certain plant is not very attractive to native bees, and they will say, but I see bees on it all the time. I see hundreds or thousands of bees. And I ask, well, do you think those are all honeybees? Sometimes they'll send pictures, and sure enough, it's all honeybees. And so depending on whether you're trying to provide resources for honeybees or our native wild bees, you'll need different plants. What are some tips for gardening for bees as well as other pollinators? Different pollinators are active at different times of the year. I mentioned that there are over 300 species of bees in Florida. These species have different periods of activity. And this is true if you live elsewhere. So for folks joining us from elsewhere, bees have different periods of activity. Some will be active only in the spring, some only in the fall, some only in the summer. And we'll also see for other pollinators that their abundance and activity varies throughout the year. So you need blooming plants throughout the year. If you live in a cold climate, the exception, of course, would be winter. But whenever you can have flowers, it's good to have them. And you'll want to have a diversity because, again, different pollinators prefer different plants. If you're planting for butterflies, hummingbirds, as well as bees, you'll need an even greater diversity. If you're primarily trying to attract just butterflies or just bees, you may need a lesser diversity, but there are still many different species of bees and many different species of butterflies. So diversity is important. We generally recommend at least 12 species of flowering herbaceous plants. So these are plants that produce showy flowers, not grasses, not gymnosperms, not conifers, at least 12 species for a particular group. So 12 bee plants or 12 butterfly plants. So if you're planting for both bees and butterflies, you may need more like 24 different plants. And have 3 blooming at any given time for your pollinator group of interest. Planting in clumps is important, especially for bees. They really are attracted to dense floral displays. So instead of dispersing your plants over a large area, think about keeping them concentrated in one particular area. Early blooming plants tend to be woody plants, trees and shrubs, while late blooming plants tend to be herbaceous. So having a combination of woody plants and herbaceous plants can ensure that you have flowers available throughout the year. I've already talked a little bit about native plants, but keep in mind that these are important, particularly as pollen sources. And they're also important for the bees that are specialists, which include many of our bee species. So they're particularly important for specialist bees and as a pollen food source. Non-native plants can provide valuable nectar. So if you're including non-native plants, try to find ones that are advertised as having a lot of nectar. So think about those non-native plants more as your nectar source and the native plants as your pollen source. Again, bees will be primarily attracted to yellow, white, and blue, purple, while red, orange, and pink flowers can attract butterflies and hummingbirds. You'll need relatively short flower tubes or flat flowers for bees. And note that bee tongue lengths do vary. So some bees have longer tongues than others, but in general, you'll need flowers with relatively short tubes or flat. Shown in the pictures on the far left is a picture of a plant that I would say has a longer and more narrow flower tube. In the middle is a plant with a shorter flower tube. It looks flat when you look from a sort of a bird's eye view, but if you were to pluck one of those little individual flowers and look at the side, you'd see a small, short, narrow flower tube. So when you're picking out flowers, it's important to really look at the flower from different angles to see whether or not it's truly flat or whether it has a flower tube if viewed from the side. And then plants in the sunflower or daisy family are what we would call flat flowers, and that's shown in the far right. I mentioned that most bees do not visit flowers with long tubes, but there are some exceptions here that I want to point out, which is that some bees can do what we call nectar robbing behavior. So they will perch on the side of a flower like this and stick their tongue into the flower tube to get the nectar. This behavior allows them to get the nectar, but they don't actually pick up any pollen because they're not coming into contact with the anthers. And only some bees do this, including bumblebees, honeybees, and carpenter bees. So the majority of bees do not do this sort of behavior and therefore need those flat flowers or flowers with very short tubes. It's only these select bees here that can do this nectar robbing behavior. Another thing to keep in mind is that bees need pollen. This, of course, is less true for butterflies if you're just focusing on butterflies, but certainly if you're trying to provide resources for bees, they need pollen. So avoid pollenless plant varieties. Some plants, including some sunflowers and some lilies, have been bred to not produce pollen. And these, of course, will not provide that key food source for bees. Another thing to keep in mind is that many flowering plants can be grown in small spaces. So if you don't have a large yard, or if you interact with people that don't have large yards and you're encouraging them to garden for pollinators or provide pollinator habitat, many of these plants do well in pots. And so you can provide a habitat or provide resources for pollinators just through using potted plants. And finally, before I go into some specific plants that we recommend, I'll point out that there are many weeds that are attractive to bees and other pollinators. These aren't things that you may want to intentionally plant in your yard, but where they can be tolerated if you manage large areas or if your community has areas that are wilder. Some of these weeds can be very beneficial for bees. So where they can be tolerated, they do produce good nectar and pollen resources. These include Bidens alba, Spanish needle, thistles, including many of our native thistles, goldenrod, and spiderwort. So again, these are weedier plants that you may not want to plant, but it is important to note that they can provide great resources for bees. Of these, I have some spiderwort and a bit of Spanish needle in my yard, and I pull out some and leave others just to keep around some additional flowers, but not let them take over my yard. Okay, so I'm going to end by talking about some specific plants, and then I'll go into some tips beyond just putting out flowers. I'll start with woody plants, and I'll mention some plants that we recommend for bees as well as other pollinators, and then I'll talk about herbaceous plants. So first in the category of woody plants are a few species that are particularly good for honeybees. They will attract other bees and other pollinators, but we find that they're really preferred by honeybees. And these include Walter's viburnum, which is a great plant for much of this portion of the country, although it may not be suitable if you're in far South Florida. Fiddlewood is another one that is suitable for South Florida and Central Florida, but may not be best in North Florida. So if you're in South Florida, this is a better option. If you're in North Florida, Walter's viburnum is a good option. They have similar looking flowers. You can note the similarities there as I go back and forth, and they're attractive to honeybees in particular. And both of these are good examples of flowers that do have a narrow, short flower tube if you pluck the flower and look from the side, although that's not really obvious from a bird's eye view. But that nectar is at the bottom of that little flower tube where my cursor is. Now I'm going to talk about some plants that are particularly good for bumblebees, which is a really important group of bee pollinators. These are the big, furry, round bees. Many bumblebees, they are a social species, and so they do have colonies, but the colonies have to start every single year. And so in the winter or spring, the queens, the new queens emerge, and they have to start colonies from scratch. So it's particularly important for bumblebees to have resources early in the year, in winter and spring, when they're starting those colonies from scratch. And then throughout the year, those colonies will produce workers, and there will be more bees to go out and collect nectar and pollen. But every single year, a lone queen has to start her colony from scratch in the winter and spring. Sparkleberry, as well as related vaccinium, including blueberry, are great resources for bumblebees early in the season. And this can include cultivated blueberry. So if you want to put out plants that will also give you fruit, the cultivated blueberry is a great option. And there are other plants in the vaccinium genus that are good as well. These again are early bloomers, and they're particularly attractive to bumblebees. And there's a whole bunch of vaccinium species. So depending on where you live, you can find a vaccinium that's suitable. Another one that is great, especially for Central and South Florida, is golden dewdrop or DURANTA. And this one produces purplish flowers. This is not native, so this is one of the few non-natives that we recommend. But bumblebees are generalists. They can visit a variety of plants, and they will consume nectar and even pollen from non-native plants. So for bumblebees in particular, non-native plants can be okay, and this is one that they do tend to visit. You'll note that many of the plants I point out for bumblebees do have blue-purple flowers. Bumblebees tend to love these blue-purple flowers. Jacaranda is another good one for South Florida, South and Central Florida. that again produces blue-purple flowers. And in this case, the flowers have large and wide flower tubes. And the bumblebees will crawl in there. And then finally, in that blue-purple category for bumblebees is chaste tree, which is also not native, but again, bumblebees will consume resources from non-native plants, and again has these blue-purple flowers that bumblebees are particularly attracted to. So for bumblebees, think about blue-purple flowers and think about having some very early spring resources for them. Eastern redbud is another early spring plant that's great for bumblebees. You can see a picture of a bumblebee visiting in the bottom, but does attract other bees as well. This is more of a northern temperate species, so may not be suitable if you're in South Florida, but does well elsewhere. And if you are in South Florida, things like chaste tree, jacaranda, and DURANTA can be good options. So moving on to other bees, these are bees that are not bumblebees or not honeybees, including our sweat bees, our leafcutter bees. Plants that are good for them include saw palmetto. This attracts a variety of pollinators, including very small pollinators, but is difficult to transplant. So this may be better if you're managing larger wild areas. It may not be the best option if you have a small kind of contained yard, but it is a good resource for pollinators in the spring, and particularly some of our smaller bodied pollinators. Cabbage or sable palm is another one that attracts a diversity of pollinators, including some of the smaller bodied. And both of these are really grown throughout Florida, but again, may not be the best options if you have a smaller yard. Fringe tree is another plant that attracts a variety of pollinators, and you'll note some commonalities in these flowers. So fringe tree, cabbage, sable palm, and saw palmetto all have sort of small white flowers. And that's a good indicator that it'll be attractive to a variety of pollinators, including smaller bodied ones. Twinberry or Simpson stopper is also a great one. Again, smaller white flowers, indicative of attractiveness to a variety of pollinators, including smaller bodied pollinators. And the nice thing about this is that it will bloom sort of sporadically year round, and again, be attractive to a variety of bees. Senna is a great option for bumblebees as well as other bees. So this attracts a variety. You can see in the bottom picture is a metallic green sweat bee. And there are a few different options, including Chapman's and privet senna, that bloom at different times and are suitable throughout much of Florida, including South Florida. So I'm going to move on to herbaceous plants. So I first started with some of our woodier plants, including things that can grow to be quite tall. Now I'm going to move on to herbaceous plants, many of which are shorter, smaller, and including some ground cover plants. Sunflower is a great option as one that kind of blooms sporadically year round and grows well throughout Florida. Beach sunflower is the species that we've had the most success with in different habitats in Florida. So it's a pretty low maintenance plant, and it's really attractive to leafcutter bees, sweat bees, and longhorn bees. Blanket flower attracts many of the same type of bees, leafcutter bees, sweat bees, and longhorned bees, and also will bloom throughout much of the year, primarily in the summer, and is also pretty low maintenance and easy to grow throughout the region. Coreopsis again attracts many of the same bees and is also low maintenance, relatively easy to grow. And there are a few different options, including Leavenworth and lance leaf. They're both native, and the uptick cultivar. So you have some options for native and then also hybrid cultivars. So all three of these, you can see that the flowers look fairly similar. They're all flat and they all have some yellow coloration. So that indicates that they're going to be attractive to a variety of pollinators, including small-bodied bees and bees with shorter tongues, because they have that flatter shape. I'm going to move on to talk about some herbaceous plants that are particularly attractive to bumblebees. Again, you'll see that color blue-purple really highlighted. So keep in mind, blue-purple, really attractive to bumblebees, while yellow and white typically indicate attractiveness to a greater variety of bees. Bee balm also known as dotted horsemint, is a plant that produces a sort of purplish flower, particularly attractive to bumblebees. This is one of the most attractive plants to bumblebees, maybe a little harder to grow in certain environments, but if you have success with it, it is a great bee resource. Salvia is one where you again have a lot of different options, including native and hybrid cultivars. So I've listed some different cultivars and species here, and this can really be grown throughout Florida in different environments. Many of the species are quite easy to grow, pretty low maintenance, and again, very attractive to bumblebees. Many have those blue-purple flowers, although the native species Salvia coccinea has a red or pinker flower. False rosemary or scrub mint. This is the genus Conradina. There are a couple different species. I like the larger flowered one, grandiflora, but there are other species as well. This plant does really well in dry environments and is really attractive to bumblebees. So if I were to plant just 2 plants for bumblebees in particular, I would probably plant salvia and false rosemary, Conradina. Partridge pea is another great option for bumblebees. This is a later blooming plant and produces yellow flowers. And we can grow it throughout Florida and also really throughout much of the country. So you can really grow this in many different places. And again, unlike a lot of the other bumblebee flowers, has a yellow flower that blooms later in the year. So it's a nice complement to some of those blue-purple flowers. And then finally, for a variety of bees, you'll see the color white highlighted again, and you'll see many flowers that are a bit smaller in size. One that we found is very attractive and that is also recommended for butterflies is snow square stem, also known as salt and pepper, and the Latin name is here. This one can take up a bit of space and it sort of has a wilder look. So if you're okay with that kind of look in your yard, it's a really great plant. As a ground cover, sunshine mimosa or powderpuff is a good option. So this grows close to the ground and is attractive to a variety of bees. So in the picture there, you can see a longhorned bee visiting, this is one of our native species, visiting the powderpuff sunshine mimosa. Stokes aster is again attractive to a variety of bees, and they come in many different colors. So you can plant a diversity of colors of Stokes aster. And is pretty easy to grow in some different environments and also in partial shade. And then finally, for honeybees in particular, basil, in particular African blue basil. So this is a good one, particularly for honeybees. It is non-native and will be a little bit less attractive to some of our native bees, but honeybees really love it. It's a great nectar source. Okay, so I want to conclude by talking about some other ways to help, and I'll spend a little bit of time on this slide because there's a few pieces of information I want to share with you. Minimizing pesticide use in your yard is important. This is especially true on flowering plants, plants that produce showy flowers. If you have grasses, including turf grasses, this will be less important for pollinators because they won't be visiting those plants for nectar or pollen. But the plants that they do visit, including ones that produce showy flowers, you want to minimize pesticide use. You want to avoid systemic insecticides, so making sure you're buying seeds or plants that have not been treated with systemic insecticides when and where possible. And when the plants are in bloom, avoiding spraying anything on or near the plants. And this includes fungicides. So there has been some recent research that suggests fungicides, while they might not outright kill the pollinators, they do disrupt their behavior and they can have effects on their ability to reproduce and care for their offspring. So avoiding spraying insecticides or fungicides when the plants are flowering is important. When the plants are not flowering, you can use products that have a short residual activity, meaning that are active for just a short period of time, and you will likely not have very many effects on pollinators if you're using products with a short activity and outside of that bloom period. You can also provide nesting resources for bees. But it's important to note that most bees do nest below ground. And so they will not be using above ground houses or hotels, but rather they dig tunnels, including short tunnels or very long tunnels below ground. In this case, you want to provide undisturbed and relatively bare soil. They can have some amount of mulch. So if you have a light straw or wood chip mulch, they may be able to dig through that and still nest, but they can't nest with a cloth barrier or a plastic barrier or a really heavy layer of mulch. Some do nest above ground. And for those bees, you can put out bee houses or hotels. These would include the things that you can buy in a store or you can make yourself. And they'll also utilize woody debris, things like hollow stems, pithy stems, rotting wood. They'll use abandoned beetle burrows, for example. So if there are areas of your yard where you can have some woody debris around, that can be good to leave out for bees, or you can put out bee houses or hotels. And you can find a lot of information about how to create these bee houses or hotels online. I recommend using a wood block and drilling your own holes into the wood block and then replacing that every 2 to 4 years. So 3 years or 4 years might be the most reasonable. That way you don't have to be replacing it every year or every 2 years, but you're not leaving it out for a decade or more. The concern with leaving these boxes out for bees is that they can build up pathogens over time. So I recommend making your own and then just replacing them every 4 years or so. But again, if you can leave woody debris around, this is great for bees. So these are some tips, particularly for bees. Of course, minimizing pesticide use will help other pollinators as well. And nesting resources for other pollinators like butterflies, they will just lay eggs on many of those pollinator plants that you put out for them. So you don't need to provide additional nesting resources for them. So with that, I will be happy to take questions. And I will point out that, again, there are a number of resources online, and I will type those into the chat box while I'm answering questions, including some EDIS documents that my lab has written and others have written on providing habitat for pollinators. So I'll include those in the chat box and happy to take questions.
Dr. Mallinger, that was fantastic. One of the comments that came in the chat box was, this is one of the most useful webinars that they've seen. And so, you know, a lot of good feedback and a lot of good questions coming in. I'll go ahead and start with some of the questions that I've seen come through. Since grasses are wind pollinated and palms are in that family, does that mean palms are wind pollinated?
Yeah, palms are not primarily animal pollinated, so wind pollinated and possibly gravity as well. Just gravity and agitation.
Sounds
yes,
good. And
question.
I know it depends a little bit on the palms because it's such a diverse group, but
yes,
certainly some of them are wind pollinated.
Yeah.
Are there blooming plants in South Florida that you know of that iguanas won't eat?
Oh, it's an interesting question. I am not sure about that. Yeah. What is I don't know if the person is available to clarify what plants in particular they've noticed being eaten by the iguanas, but yeah, I'm not sure.
One of the comments that came in was that iguanas eat everything.
Right.
I'm not a South Florida guy, so my experience is more in Central and North Florida. So I haven't directly experienced the iguanas, but I doubt you have either.
No, I haven't. You know, as I was thinking about it, I imagine it's maybe comparable to deer and you know, other kinds of animals that will eat a variety of plants. And you know, for those larger animals, you can fence and try to keep them out. For iguanas, that's probably a little bit harder. So yeah, unfortunately, I'm not quite sure what the best recommendation for that would be.
Yeah, looking at the chat, it's people are sharing iguanas don't like fire bushes. They love hibiscus. They don't like gingers. They do love dendrobium orchids. So it's interesting. Thank you, folks, for sharing your experiences, because, as I said, I don't have that South Florida experience.
Right. Yeah, and that is challenging, certainly. I see people writing that they don't like dogs, I think, too. So rabbits eating flowers. So firebush is a good one. We see surprising diversity of pollinators on firebush, given the flower color and shape, but I have seen little sweat bees visit, honeybees, of course. So yeah, firebush is a nice one.
Super. What happens if the food sources are available only part of the year? Will the bees migrate or leave in search of more diversity for a home habitat?
Yeah, great question. So bees do not migrate. Basically, I'll briefly describe the cycle of a bee. So an adult bee will emerge from the nest at a particular time of the year. And again, I mentioned some bees will emerge in the spring, some species in the summer, some in the fall. And those adult bees will forage for a period of time. They'll collect nectar and pollen, and they will construct their own nests and provide that nectar and pollen for their own offspring. Then that adult bee will die. So how long does that adult bee live for? It varies across species, but often, and also across environments, but it can be as short as just a few weeks. It may be as long as a couple of months. So for a given individual bee or a given bee species, they need those flowers available when they are foraging. And if those flowers are not available, they can't migrate or move very far. A bee, after she emerges from the nest, she will make her own nest somewhere nearby, and then she will stay in the vicinity of that nest until she dies. And by vicinity, depending on the size of the bee, that can only be 100 or 200 meters, or it can be maybe as much as a kilometer. So basically that bee needs flowers from 100 meters or 1 kilometer away from the nest. And if there aren't any, then she simply will not be able to have as many offspring, and she may die earlier. So in sum, no, they can't, they can't migrate. They can't really go very far. They need the flowers in that area. So the good news is that, if you have flowers in a small area, you can do a lot to help bees. They don't need resources over a long migratory pathway like monarchs, for example. The bad news is if those resources aren't there, there's not much that they can do about it. They can't go very far.
Okay, very cool. What pollinators are attracted to white flowers?
Good question. White flowers can attract butterflies. For example, the snow square stem salt and pepper I mentioned is one that's recommended for butterflies as well. So they can attract butterflies, and then they really attract many of our native bees, including sweat bees, leafcutter bees, and longhorned bees. We do see bumblebees on them occasionally, although I mentioned that bumblebees really tend to like blue-purple flowers, but they will visit white flowers. And honeybees will also visit white flowers. So white flowers are attractive to a diversity, including many bees, as well as some butterflies.
Okay, great. You're knocking off a few questions at a time. That's great. One of the people said, noted that Gaillardia is now not being considered native as of 2020 or so. I know they're saying that it's primarily native west of Texas, but it is naturalized all through Florida.
Right, and there are different. There's Gaillardia pulchella, which is the the sort of naturalized. At least some think of it as native, and then there are other options too that are not, like Gaillardia aristata. So that's not native. So there are different Gaillardia species. And yes, there are some plants that are naturalized, but what exactly is their native range has been debated or changed over time.
Great. Interesting question coming up. Does keeping honeybees discourage native wild bees from visiting your landscape?
Yeah, it definitely can. My position on honeybees is that if you want to produce honey, they're the only bees that are going to do that. If you have crops that need pollination and you don't have enough wild pollinators, they're also a really great crop pollinator. Certainly, if you're a commercial farmer, you're going to depend on honeybees. But I do think it's important to note that keeping honeybees is not a conservation activity. You aren't helping the native wild fauna by having honeybees. So you certainly may be helping your crop pollination, and if you're producing honey, they're the only ones that are going to do that. But if your primary goal is to help pollinator diversity, having honeybees can actually have a negative effect. And it depends on how many honeybees you have and how many flowers are in your landscape.
Do bees need a water source?
Yeah, good question. So honeybees definitely do. And what we know about other bees is a little bit mixed, but some do and some don't is basically the answer. And typically shallow pools of water are best for that. So, you know, in Florida, in some environments, there's probably going to be enough just natural sources, but you can put out shallow sources of water, particularly if you're a beekeeper, if you have honeybees.
Great. Are native orchids a good source of pollen for bees?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we've looked a little bit into the native orchids and whether or not they're visited by bees. And there are some bees that will visit native orchids. It's not a large diversity of bees. And you know, if you were to plant orchids, I would definitely recommend native over non-native. But in terms of attracting a diversity of bees, they may not be the best for that. But I think some of them are primarily self-pollinated and don't rely on animal pollinators. But they, yeah, if you're going to plant them, I would recommend the native over the non-native. We do have a non-native orchid bee in Florida. So that is a bee that does visit orchids, but it's actually not native. It's from Central America. And so it may visit some of the native orchids, but it also visits a diversity of plants here because it's not native to Florida. So we don't have any native orchid bees in Florida.
Let's see, I'm just trying to see, we've been making through pretty well. You answered the questions about the bee houses. That's really good. Let's see. How do you balance a bee, bird, water source, and mosquitoes?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, for bees, I probably would not put anything out unless you're a beekeeper, because I do think the mosquito control issue is an important one. And, you know, for birds, I know it's more common to put out bird baths. I think that if it's a fountain of sorts, I don't know that mosquitoes would nest in kind of bubbling, moving water. They tend to like still water. So that might be an option to again, prevent mosquitoes from laying eggs in the water, is to have it be a more moving water source. But for bees in particular, unless you're a beekeeper and you have a lot of colonies that you're worried about, I wouldn't put out water for bees. Birds may be a different story. But again, you might be able to use a bubbler or a fountain of some sort in that case.
All right. Well, Dr. Mallinger, you've gotten the questions answered. Again, amazing presentation. You covered a lot of stuff, made it, you know, really understandable. And it's one of the, this is one thing I will go back and watch this presentation over again when I can concentrate on the presentation just a little bit more. That leads me to just announce to everybody, Claire a couple of times has put in the chat box the link. You know, every one of these webinars does get posted to our website, to the FFL website. It's a great resource that you or your friends or employees could go back and, you know, learn a little bit, especially if it's on one of those days when you can't work. You know, maybe it's raining or you have some downtime. Go back and see if you can't catch some of those presentations you might have missed. This one will go up. It usually takes somewhere around 10 to 14 days before the website is updated, but know that you will be able to go back and view Dr. Mallinger's presentation again. So thank you so very much for the wonderful knowledge, the great presentation, and we look forward to you joining us again.
Yeah, you're welcome. I did just put a link that I thought I put in the chat before, but I just put it in now. That has some of these plants that I mentioned. It has a broader plant list, and it specifies the region. So particularly, I know there were some questions about Southwest Florida and South Florida. The regions are mentioned in that publication.
Fantastic. What a great resource. Dr. Mallinger, thank you very much. Everybody, please join us again next month for our webinar again, the second Tuesday of every month at 10 o'clock. Have a great day.
Bye.